To record. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Final Girls Berlin Brain Binge. Um, our Final Girls Berlin Film Festival is a horror film festival dedicated to the works of women and non binary filmmakers. And at the festival, we also have talks and workshops. And now we're presenting a virtual version, a virtual symposium for these talks. And we're very happy to have Adia Cullors with us today for her talk, Historical Horror, Kindred, and Historical Memory. Adia Cullors is a Baltimore based historian and archivist who writes on Black history, queer culture, and genre film. Cullors has worked as an archivist for both the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Johns Hopkins Medical History Archives. She wrote her thesis, About the Bodies: How the Modern Museum Helped Invent Race, in 2021, and since continues to explore Black death culture and justice through her writing for the Order of the Good Death. So thank you so much for being here with us, Adia. After the talk, we'll be having a Q&A, so you can participate in that via the chat function, or you can also raise your hand and participate in person. Thanks. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. As we said, my name is Adia. I focus in Black Atlantic history and Black horror media. And the impetus for this presentation came because I've recently had a fellowship under the incredible Dr. Leslie King Hammond, who is a prominent historian, artist, and scholar of Black history, Black art, and Black culture here in Baltimore, Maryland. And she served as one of two historical consultants for the Kindred series, which is an adaptation of Octavia Butler's novel of the same name that is currently streaming on Hulu. And she did something kind of different and interesting in terms of bringing historical realism and truth to this project, which is she created a group of artists located in Baltimore through the Maryland Institute College of Art, who she guided through creating these intricate, historically accurate, handmade props and set pieces that were then used on the series. And she put a lot of detail and effort into doing this research, and she brought me along on this journey. And she brought all of us along on this journey of putting truth and Maryland culture and Maryland voices on screen. And one thing she kept saying throughout this project was, we're not doing Roots. Roots being a classic 80s series about enslavement in the Deep South that has also kind of come to represent this kind of more generic representation of enslavement in the American Deep South in visual media. And it was her goal to make this very specific to Maryland, very specific to our culture and our history. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of context about Kindred as a story, as a novel, and as a now filmed adaptation. The novel was originally published in 1979 by Octavia Butler. And it's the story of a 26-year-old Black woman in California named Dana. In the book, it's set in the 1970s, and in the show, it's adapted to be set in 2016. And Dana finds herself pulled against her will into the early 1800s, back to the Maryland plantation where her Black ancestors were once enslaved by her white ancestors. And as the story progresses, she finds herself pulled back for longer and longer periods of time. She even accidentally brings back, who is her husband in the book and her boyfriend in the series, who's white, with her. And she suffers through the trauma and abuse of enslavement. She gets entangled with the politics and the society on the plantation with her ancestors, as she works in the past to ensure the survival of her family in the future, so that she has something to return to, and so that her ancestors, of which she is one, has something to live for. So this is a story that has themes of familial bonds, of repressed trauma, of cycles of trauma, of autonomy, and of what we owe to our families, and also what we can and what we cannot escape from our collective and from our personal pasts. So I'm just going to play a short teaser trailer to get more at like the general atmosphere of the show and of the source material. So I'll play that now.
Started yesterday. The time traveling. I was here. Suddenly, I wasn't here. My mother is alive. She's been stuck there. Am I crazy? You don't believe me, do you?
So as you can tell from watching that, it's a story that has horror at its core. Kindred is an early foundational text for Black feminist science fiction and horror. It's highly influential. If you're watching that, you might be reminded of things that have come out recently, such as Lovecraft Country or Antebellum. And you can tell from its atmosphere, it's deeply suspenseful, it's scary, it's horrific, it's a little disorienting. But despite that, for a long time, it's been left out of larger conversations about science fiction and horror canon. As with what happens with a lot of Black works, they're not really considered part of that canon. They get sidelined more as just dramas or historical fictions or slave narratives. But since the runaway success of Get Out in 2016, Black horror has really been catapulted into the mainstream cultural lexicon. And so Kindred is being reevaluated and given its flowers as this cornerstone work of the Black horror genre. And the recent release of the show has really accelerated that and really started an interest in Kindred in Octavia Butler's work and in larger Black feminist science fiction horror as a whole. So now that we have a bit more of that context, I'm just going to go briefly through the structure of what this talk's going to look like before we really get into the meat of it. So we're going to start with just some theory and some background. What is a historical fiction horror movie? What is the work that it's doing? What sets it apart from other entries into the horror genre? Then we're going to take a deep look at some of the props that were made for the Kindred project that I assisted on and how that contributes to creating a textured visual language and why that's especially important when you're looking at the historical horror subgenre. And then I've pulled three different examples of historical horror movies, specifically that center women and that I think really interact well when talking about Kindred. The first one is The Witch in 2015. The second one is Anibaba, which came out in 1964. That's a typo, I should say 64. And the last one is The Nightingale, which came out in 2018. So light spoilers for all of these movies. Should still watch them. But yeah, we'll be touching on their plots a little bit. And then we're going to wrap up with some discussions of gender and of how we approach incorporating history with horror media in an ethical and effective way. And then we're going to have some time for questions. So let's get to it. So the first general question is really just why horror as a vehicle for looking at history? Horror isn't really, and especially film isn't really actually the first thing a historian would go to when trying to get at truth. Film itself is highly, highly subjective because it's putting you in the shoes of a person, because you're looking through one viewpoint at a time, and because you're feeling all of the feelings of the character on screen. And then why horror? Why not historical drama? Why not documentary? So I don't think anyone here is going to be shocked by the theory that horror is a deeply political subgenre. There's been a lot of recent scholarship that I think most people are pretty aware of at this point, that horror is something that reflects the attitudes and fears of the time in which it's produced. For example, the idea that the atomic age in the United States produced a lot of movies like Invasions of the Body Snatchers and Them, about the dangers of science going wrong, or that American slashers got really gritty and gory because of the Vietnam War. So this idea that horror is something that reflects what we're feeling in the moment, that's pretty accepted. Um, and historical horror movies, movies that intentionally set themselves in a historical past, have been a part of horror films since the very beginning, since before they were really movies, since they were just motion pictures. And a lot of the time, at the beginning of film history, those movies would be set in this kind of like vague Victorian Gothic place. Where the use of dark castles and cobwebs and peasants was supposed to evoke this era of mystery, of a time before science and knowledge, where there was still magic and there was still intrigue. Um, and I think the way that horror is so subjective is really at the core of what makes it such a good vehicle for approaching history. Horror works when you're trying to go beyond just a factual truth, when you're trying to convey an emotional truth. Because horror films are something that deals with base emotions and instincts. It can churn up real physiological responses from us. It can spike our adrenaline. It can shock us. It can disgust us. It can make us sweat. It can make us cry. And at the end of that roller coaster of emotion, we feel relief. And horror is at its best when all of those things are in balance. And using an artistic medium that can so effectively conjure up these base emotions with us, it's ideal for exploring history when what we want to do is explore the emotional weight of history. You can never really truly mimic what it feels like to be at a time, at a place, in a situation. But we can use horror as a tool, as an artistic tool for conjuring up feelings and for creating empathy, and for using this empathy to deepen our understanding of the historical. So, when it comes to historical horror fiction, even more so than just the horror genre in general, there's this really deep importance placed on the relationship between the viewer and the character. Um, horror historical fiction is kind of strange when it comes to this. Because as a viewer, when you are watching something that is historical fiction, you're never truly an entirely impartial observer outside of the plot. Historical films take place in the exact same world that the viewer, we, live in, albeit in a different time, a different space, a different context. But there's this always this idea that we're complicit, we're involved in some way, because the events on screen, the time period they're taking place in, what's going on, what unfolds, and what comes after. That's responsible for creating the version of the world that we're living in now. So we're on the same timeline with our characters. There's just this massive gulf of time and understanding separating us. Um, and because of that, we kind of have this inherent power over the characters on screen in terms of our understanding. For example, if you're watching a movie about a war, maybe you already know how that war ended and who won. And you automatically know whether the character on screen is going to survive or not, and or whether their struggle throughout the plot is going to be worth it or not. Maybe you know that before you even press play or enter the theater. And so as a result, when you're engaging with historical film, you're kind of automatically prompted to fill in the gaps from when that character you're following story ends up to now. What has to happen for you to get from that character to you as a viewer? It prompts you to be an active participant and an active viewer. And this forcing us to do this work really like amplifies the levels of empathy that we can feel. And it really works to immerse us within the timeline of the characters, within their world. It helps us understand their motivations better. And in the context of Kindred, Dana is kind of acting as the audience conduit. She's our contemporary, and she is literally drawn back into the past with all of the feelings and attitudes of a person in our timeline. And that's kind of why, when transitioning from the book to the series, it was important to update when it takes place, because Dana absolutely has to be walking in tandem with her, with the audience. We have to be with her. We have to share her attitudes and her experiences in order to truly understand what it's like to suddenly be pulled across that gulf of time and understanding and forced to confront the past. Um, and Octavia Butler was really aware of this when she was writing Kindred. This is an excerpt from when Dana witnesses the first beating um, of an enslaved person on the plantations. He says, "I have seen people beaten on television and in the movies. I had seen the two red blood substitutes streaked across their backs and heard their well-rehearsed screams. But I hadn't lain nearby and smelled their sweat or heard them pleading and praying, shamed before their families and themselves. I was probably less prepared for the reality than the child crying not far from me." Um, so Octavia Butler is intentionally doing this and crafting this narrative. She's intentionally taking the viewer and forcing you to not just be an impartial watcher or an impartial reader, but to be immersed in the plot, to be walking in tandem with Dana, and to understand what it is to have to confront history, and to understand how disorienting and fearful and horrifying that can be. So something that's really important for creating um, this relationship with history is that you have to really be immersed in the world of it in order to believe it. You're building a world, you're building texture. And so the visuals are really important to that when it comes to historical fiction. Um, and we're going to touch a little bit more on that later when we talk about authenticity. But now I'm going to get into some of the props that we created for Kindred and why they were important and what work they did on screen. So one of the props that we spent the absolute most amount of time on was these quilts that we hand sewed and that we based on specific patterns that would have been used for quilt making in homes in the early 1800s. And each character within the narrative of the series is given their own quilt, and each quilt is modeled after a specific pattern and has its own design and fabric choice that's used kind of as this underlying subtle language that shows the status of the characters on the plantation and the relationship to the other characters. And we also use the quilts to incorporate these nods to resistance and to culture and survival in the quilts of the enslaved people. Um, for example, the quilt on the left belongs to Margaret, who is the wife of the owner of the plantation. And you can see it's really delicately stitched together. There's a lot of like beautiful, detailed, supple, vibrant fabric being used. And then on the right, we have one of the quilts of one of the enslaved people. And as you can see, it's comprised of different patchwork pieces of fabric that would have just been found around the plantation and that would have been discarded by the white people in the house on the plantation. And that is kind of like a nod to the relationship that the enslaved people would have had with the people who were enslaving them. That they're taking their scraps and that they're using them to remake items for themselves, which is a nod to a certain type of resistance and a certain type of survival. And you can see on the left another one of the slave blankets, and then on the top right, it being used within the series. And again, this idea that these people are scavenging what they can and creating things for themselves based on just what is available, what is discarded. And then we see in the bottom right corner is the son of the owner of the plantation. His name is Rufus. And he also has a quilt. And once again, you can see the difference in craftsmanship. It's saying something about each character, about their place on the plantation. And these quilts were really important to us as a tool for conveying resistance. You can kind of see on the left, this is the bottom, the burlap, just bottom of one of the slave blankets. And if you look, you can see this slight diamond shape that we incorporated into it. And that diamond shape is really important to us. It's based off of these archaeological findings from Eastern Maryland, where Kindred is set. And you can see a picture of one of these archaeological digs. And what we found, what people found on these sites was that the enslaved people were burying beneath their cabins where they lived these artifacts, talismans, glass beads, shells, bones, coins, in these very specific shapes and patterns, these like diamond shapes, that were symbols of protection that had been brought over in their shared collective memory across the Atlantic during the Middle Passage. And they were secretly incorporating these into their homes on the plantation to avoid punishment, but to still have these talismans of protection and safety for themselves and for their families. And so we added those. You can see again in the slave blanket on the bottom right. It was important for us to add these symbols as these subtle nods to that history, because we wanted there to just always be an undercurrent of resistance, and because we wanted there to be visual representations of that resistance and of that surviving African culture on screen. Another subtle but necessary piece of prop work that we did was just like the kitchen rags that are used throughout the series. And those are period accurate fabric, they're cotton, and the method that we used for distressing them was we would tea stain them with just black tea and then run them through dryers and then distress them with needles and then burn them by hand with cast iron skillets. Because it was important for us, for the work, for the labor, for the time on the plantation to be represented in all of the props and all of the sets that are on screen. We want things to feel lived in. We want you to be able to look at the screen and feel the time, the labor that goes into these people's lives day in and day out. So a question that comes up a lot when talking about this kind of work is why all of this work? It is a lot of labor being put into making something authentic. But if you're not a historian and you can't tell the difference between, say, rayon, like modern day rayon, and authentic homespun wool, then why is this important to you? Why put so much detail into minutia like kitchen rags or tiny, tiny details in quilts? And while I was doing research for this, I discovered there was a really big debate about this when The Witch came out in 2015. And The Witch is probably, for most people watching, when you think of historical horror, one of the first things you think of. It really sparked an interest in the subgenre. And Robert Eggers, the director, was infamously obsessed with the historical accuracy of his film. He spent 4 years just doing archival research on the minutia of it, on the fabrics of the costumes, on the wood for the sets, on the language for the word choice in the dialogue. And both Kindred and The Witch are pretty bare bones productions visually. In The Witch, this family, they're Puritans. And then in Kindred, most of the characters are enslaved people. So these aren't fancy, opulent settings we're talking about. We're talking about undyed wool. We're talking about bare wood. So why not just default to using generic historical looking pieces and costumes? And that's something that came up during the planning for the production of Kindred. Often that is what happens when slavery is depicted on screen, American slavery, that is. People tend to default for this just generic deep South American aesthetic. And Kindred is a very Maryland project. Eastern Maryland is a deeply rich place historically, especially when it comes to the history of enslavement. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman both lived there. And because of its location right on the border between the North and the South, it has a much different visual language and visual history than the Deep South would. So it was important to make sure that we added the texture to this film, because in filmmaking, visual language and sight and sound are basically characters in and of themselves, because this is the medium. It's important that when you're using visual language, you use it to deepen your understanding of the characters. For example, using the quilts as a secondary way of explaining relationships to one another and statuses within the community and relationships to other characters. That's another way of deepening the plot, another way at getting at the truth. And sometimes it doesn't always resonate and you don't always notice it automatically, but you do feel it when you're watching a movie that defaults to being more generic. You can tell that there's something missing. There's a truth, there's a heart, there's a texture, there's a depth that just is not there. And Robert Eggers, when making The Witch, when asked about the attention paid to authenticity, what he often spoke about was this idea of collective memory. This idea that when you go into anything involving history, you already kind of have a preconceived notion of what that time period looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, what it would have been like to be there. Even if you're not a historian, and even if what you're picturing isn't accurate, there's something in your mind that already lives there. And when you're making a historical horror film, you are playing with what the audience already knows about the past or thinks they know. And everything you do on screen either confirms this or subverts this, but it is something you have to engage with. So the second movie I want to talk about is a little bit less well known. It's called Onibaba. It is a Japanese film that came out in 1964. And the director is Kaneto Shindu. And it is a movie that hits at a second type of historical horror that we haven't really talked about yet. So Kindred and The Witch, the setting and the topic are the same. The Witch is set in 1600s New England. It's about that time period. Kindred is in part set in early 1800s Maryland, and it's about that time period. Onibaba, however, is different. It deals more in allegory and in metaphor as a means of hitting at historical truth. So Onibaba, which roughly translates to the demon hag and is how it is referred to a lot in texts and scholarship, is a story of a mother and a daughter-in-law, mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, who are struggling to survive in rural 15th century Japan amidst civil war, when the husband slash son goes off to war. And in order to survive, these two together ambush and kill passing samurai who are coming through their area. They sell their belongings and they discard their bodies in this massive pit. And when the daughter-in-law begins this romantic and sexual relationship with another man, that threatens the dynamic between the two women, and also threatens the survival strategy of the older woman who is afraid of being left behind and dying because she no longer has somebody who can work with her to kill these men and sell their belongings for food. So the older woman kills a samurai and steals his Hanya mask. And it turns out that in addition to looking terrifying, the mask is also cursed. And she wears the mask in an attempt to frighten her daughter-in-law into staying by her side. But she gets her comeuppance when she realizes that because the mask is cursed, she's unable to remove it. And eventually the mask horribly disfigures her. So the director, Kaneto Shindu, is infamous for saying that his whole career, what he desired to do was make a film that took place in the moment right as the atomic bomb was detonated on Hiroshima. And he's made movies about this before. If you've heard of him, you might have heard of his documentary, Children of Hiroshima. But this movie about feudal Japan actually ends up being one of his most emotionally devastating films about Hiroshima. Because despite not being set anywhere near the time period of 1945, when the bombs were dropped on Japan, this film is about the post-war truth, the post-war emotional truth that Japan was dealing with after the bombs were dropped. The time period that he made this film, post-war 60s Japan, was a time period where a lot of media coming out of Japan was focusing on this trope of weaponized feminine frailty. And that was intentional. It was supposed to contrast with the weaponized masculinity that Japan had pushed as part of its propaganda during the war. It was so this idea that Japan was using women to try to cast itself as a victim in a way to get around taking accountability for the atrocities that Japan committed in the Pacific theater during the war. And the director wanted to explore the horrors of atomic warfare and its repercussions on the population, but he didn't want Japan to just skirt responsibility for its atrocities. It wanted to confront these. And so he used the allegory of Onibaba, not just to get at an emotional truth, but also as a pragmatic way of masking his true intentions, so that he didn't cause controversy, so that this movie could actually be made and get out there, because he wasn't technically making a film about Japan post-war. And also the fact that these are women is important because it's in dialogue with that idea of feminine frailty that was so prominent at the time. And it's in direct contrast with it. Because these women, they're not just victims, they're survivors. They're doing horrible things and they're acting in horrible ways under horrible circumstances, but they're not just pretty and frail. The things they do are repugnant at times. They're complex characters. They're hard to root for. So while this film isn't set in 1945, it is about the emotional reality of post-war Japan. It is about a population dealing with the emotional and physical scarring of the war. And in fact, the disfigurement that the mother-in-law suffers from the mask was actually modeled on the injuries that people had gotten from radiation sickness following the bomb being dropped. So it's also about that. It's about the decisions that these people are making and why. It's about the breakdown of familial bonds through war. And it's about the weaponization of national identity and pride, and what happens when that kind of weaponization leads to atrocities. The mask is a symbol of Japan's cultural history, but it is being weaponized by the older woman in order to terrorize her companion. And another interesting component about Onibaba is it really reflects the contemporary ways that people were talking about history and about the events of the war at the time. We know from historical texts and from interviews that it was common for Japanese people after the bomb was dropped to speak about the bomb itself in terms of demons and spirits, to use this language of religion and magic to convey the true depths of the horror that they felt at its effects. So this is just a way that, unlike realism, such as in The Witch or in Kindred, historical horror can use different time periods to layer on top of each other. And you can see from the breakdown what time periods are represented. That what we're doing is we're layering moments on top of each other to kind of create this cultural thread through Japanese history. So the last movie I want to talk about is The Nightingale, which came out in 2018. And we're going to use The Nightingale to talk about responsibility, framing, and focus within historical horror movies when you're dealing with things that are atrocious and traumatic and carry deep emotional weight. So horror films, as we know, can generate a lot of discourse about content. They can be very sexual, they can be violent, they can be gory. They get derided as mean-spirited, exploitative, or schlocky a lot of the time. And this is a genre that deals regularly in things like sex and death, and also in camp and exaggeration and drama. When we watch horror movies, we want things to be turned up to 11 a lot of the time. And it can be hard to square that when you're situating your plot in times and events that actually transpired. especially if you're including characters that are based on or actually depicting real people. And especially if the events you're dealing with are atrocities that carry serious emotional weight for groups and for people today. And there tend to be two schools of thought surrounding media depiction like this. There are people who think that there are some things that are so horrible they cannot ever be depicted, and attempting to do so is irresponsible and insulting. And there are people who think that there are things that are so horrible that they must be represented, and that not representing these things is irresponsible because it is creating silence around them. And a lot of whether or not we might consider an aspect of historical horror to be responsible or good comes down to who is creating those representations and how they're creating them and for whom. Um, so when The Nightingale came out, it became quickly one of the most controversial historical horror films in recent memory. It came out in 2018. It was directed by Jennifer Kent, who you might know as the director of The Babadook. And The Nightingale is a story of an Irish convict named Claire, who was forced into servitude to a colonial British lieutenant during the Black War, which was a time period in which British forces were colonizing Tasmania and committing genocide against the indigenous population. So Claire, after being brutally sexually assaulted and raped, and having both her child and her husband murdered, embarks on this revenge mission to kill the lieutenant who's responsible. And along the way, she's accompanied by Billy, an Aboriginal guide, who she starts out as being very racist and suspicious of, but who she eventually forms this mutual respect and then friendship with as they bond over a shared desire for revenge against the British and also a parallel trauma at the hands of British imperial violence. This movie was controversial for two reasons. One, because of its incredibly graphic depictions of rape and sexual violence. It is a rape revenge movie that functions in the same style as something like I Spit on Your Grave, with the added element of using the setting of British colonialism. It kind of uses this paralleling between the colonial violation of the land and the violation of Claire's body and the indigenous women who are also violated by white men throughout the film. And it parallels those two together to talk about violation and colonialism. And there's also the element of race, which was another point of controversy for the film. And Jennifer Kent put a lot of effort, similarly to Kindred and The Witch, in trying to bring authenticity and some element of historical truth and accuracy into the film. There's a use of Palawakani, which is a constructed language that Aboriginal scholars and elders have pulled together using surviving texts about Aboriginal people in Tasmania before the Black War to kind of recreate this lost language. And that is used throughout the film because Jennifer Kent consulted with Aboriginal elders and scholars to try to bring their voice into it. But still, there is this question of Jennifer Kent as a creator who is a white Australian woman who is telling this experience of colonialism, partially seen through the eyes of a white woman in Australia, but partially through the eyes of Billy, an Aboriginal man. And by trying to parallel and contrast their experiences, a lot of question was brought up in the way that Claire is the main character. She's the protagonist. It's her story we're following. And ultimately, a lot of the time, her voice really eclipses Billy's voice and the voices of a lot of the other Aboriginal people. So it really calls into question when you're using history to talk about atrocities that are still very real, like colonialism, like the death of culture, how do you decide who's going to be your protagonist? How do you follow one person and still incorporate the voices and experiences of those around that one character? When we're talking about the Nightingale, what we see from Claire is we see a person who's been taken from her home by colonialism and who longs to go back but never really can. And you see Billy, who's a person whose home itself has been stolen by colonialism and who can't really go back because that home doesn't exist in the same way. Um, and this idea that those two things are equal is something that created a lot of tension and a lot of controversy when this film came out. Um, so it really does speak to the idea that who is given screen time, whose story we're following, where the emotional weight of the narrative is placed is really, really essential. And so is considering who is making the film. Because The Nightingale, despite being about atrocities of colonialism, by being made by white people in Australia, and still coming from a seat of colonial power. So a lot of the films, all of the films really that I've talked about today, I've chosen to explore because they have female protagonists at their center. And they use gender as an essential tool of exploring historical narrative. When Octavia Butler was writing Kindred, something that's not very well known is she originally intended for Dana's character to be a Black man. But she decided against this, and she decided she wanted to write her as a woman because she thought that a woman would survive in the circumstances she was in for longer. And part of that is because Octavia Butler wrote that Black men often, as we know, are perceived as really aggressive, are perceived as more threatening, and that this would create more opportunities for violence and for potential death within the narrative. But also, she wanted Dana to be a Black woman because she felt that this added consciousness of being not just a Black person, but a woman who had to endure the misogyny of 2016 and of the 70s when the book was originally written, would be able to apply that understanding of what it is to have to be submissive in a culture better to the time period, and that she would be better be able to navigate her new status as an enslaved person in a way that was clever and was effective for her survival, because she would be able to connect her experience as a woman in the present day to the experience of women in the past. And I think in similar ways, all of these movies use gender as a thread to connect contemporary viewers to the characters that are present in the past. Because gender and the oppression of women, misogyny, etc., these are all elements that exist in each time period and manifest themselves in different ways. But this is an understanding that really transcends each era and can connect viewers in a way that is unfortunately permanently relatable. So as we're coming to an end, a question we should ask is how should we approach horror through the should we approach history, sorry, through the medium of horror? What is essential to remember when we're engaging or even if we're making historical horror films of our own? And these are just some points that through my research I came to. The first one is that you can't just replicate horrific events from the past. You have to make a meaning of them. It's one thing to depict things like enslavement and brutality and assault, but why are you doing so? What is the emotional weight of them? What are the lasting consequences? And second is that you have to honestly engage with who's making the film and from where. If you're making a film about colonialism and it's coming from the seat of colonial power, how does that impact the narrative you're telling? How does that impact where you automatically want to place your focus and what characters get your understanding, get your empathy, And off of that, who are you making films for? Is it for the audience is the audience that you're making films for also who is on screen? Or is it somebody else? And third is we have to acknowledge that what is on screen isn't and cannot be objective truth. Um, Film and horror film, as we've talked about, these are things that deal with emotions, that deal with gut reactions. And while we can conjure up emotional truths that come close to historical reality, what we're not actually seeing is historical reality. We're seeing it filtered through we're seeing history filtered through the time period that these films are being created in. Um, and that's not truth. And remembering that is essential because when you're dealing with historical film, you can very easily veer into propaganda. Which brings me to my final point, which is you have to maintain complexity and depth. It's easy for historical figures in fiction to end up being caricatures or just one-dimensional symbols of things. But when we ensure that we are injecting complexity, depth back into these characters, and we're better able to understand why they're making the decisions that they're making and the place that these characters hold in the historical timeline. And I think the main takeaway from this is the heart of historical horror really is empathy. It's using horror as a tool to intentionally conjure up emotions and to parallel experiences that are universal and that unite us across millennia, across thousands of miles, and that can transcend these cultural boundaries that otherwise seem pretty impermeable. And that's because everyone everywhere, no matter our culture, our nation, our identities, we're all haunted by these varying specters of national memory. And historical horror works by resuscitating that memory, by forcing us to confront it, and by forcing us to confront our own role in our countries, in the places where we are in a historical timeline. Um, Horror, as we're always saying, is at its core the return of the repressed. And so it is an ideal vehicle for dealing with history and forcing us really to confront it. So that brings me to the end of what I have to say through my presentation. If you'd like to keep up with me or my work, you can follow my Instagram. You can also shoot me an email. I love talking about history and horror, and I love collabing with people. And I will have a Substack coming soon if you'd also like to follow more of my writing or research. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Adia. That was such an illuminating talk. And I'm, yeah, I feel like I need like a few minutes to let all of that settle in. If anyone has any questions, we have the chat function, we have the hand raising function, so you can um, raise your hand and then unmute yourself if you'd like to participate. Um, I guess I was wondering if during your research you also were dealing a lot with other films that were like particularly poor examples of yeah, the way that filmmakers treated historical horror.
Yeah, there are a lot. One thing that kept coming up, it's not strictly horror, was Birth of a Nation, just because it is such a important presence in film, and it is so controversial, but was literally a film that was used as a tool to incite violence against Black people by distorting historical truth. So that was really something I was thinking of, the idea that you can literally use film as a medium to attack people and to create um, actions in reality that have these like horrible and very real consequences. So that was something I was dealing with a lot that was coming up.
Yeah, I found it particularly poignant when you were describing how horror cinema can so quickly, especially historical horror, can so quickly veer into the realm of propaganda, and that it does play so much with the viewer's identification and emotions, and that if these particular historical events are too flattened or portrayed with constant stereotypes, for example, that are harmful, then this can have very negative repercussions for yeah the audience.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can talk about it a bit more. The collaboration you had with the Kindred production team, like it was really great that they were so emphasizing the authenticity and seeking your help. I was wondering if in the process, did they also check in with you, like actually with the finished product, or like was there some kind of relationship there? And also how you feel about the finished product, if you can say.
Yeah, so everything really went through Dr. Leslie King Hammond, who is really the main historical consultant who was guiding all of us. And she really divided up and said, here are the main things we want to focus on, and put everybody into teams. So we were all collaborating and we could all see what everyone was working on and give input to each other. And then she'd take pictures and send them back to production, because production was based in Georgia. But we were working in Maryland because they wanted Maryland artists and Maryland voices. And so once we were finished with things, we'd ship them off. And sometimes production would get back to us and say, we need more of this, or we want more of that, or we want you to do this differently. So it was kind of like a strange way of doing things. But it also really gave us a degree of creative freedom to just kind of like pick and choose and look at historical research and books on quilting and historical examples in archives and in local museums, and say, oh, that would look great. We should put that in there. So yeah. And what happened to the quilts? They are property of Disney. I believe I was told that there will be Disney has like an archive of their own, where they keep all of their props that they use for films and for series. So that's where they are. And another thing that's interesting is when you're making props for film, you have to make 2 of everything, and they have to be identical, because what if something happens to one? So we ran into the issue of we're hand sewing all of these like very intricate quilts, and they're all a little bit different because some of them are like stained differently, or some of the cloths are burned differently, and then we go, oh my God, we have to replicate everything exactly because it's going to read on camera as weird if one of the props is different than the other one. So yeah.
When you were talking about Oni Baba and this layering of the narrative time frame with the time frame at which the film was created, I was wondering if there were other particularly relevant examples of that you came across in your research.
Yeah. Not to bring up Kindred again, but Kindred I think is a really cool example of it because it's literally somebody who is in 2 different timelines at once. And so it's literally bringing 2 different experiences and attitudes into one place, and that's really what I think makes the storyline work so well. Is that like juxtaposition? So yeah. And then there's there are other examples that I think people kind of like know off the top of their heads, like Godzilla is about fear of the atomic bomb and about science going wrong, and that comes out right after the bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, and I feel like that's one of the main examples people go to. It's kind of like a fun fact, but what it lacks is it doesn't really get at any sort of like emotional weight. Really, it starts and ends at atomic science and energy is scary and monstrous, but films like Anibaba, I think, are better at getting at more personal stories and more personal truths.
Yeah, I really loved all your 3 films. Like, all these examples were wonderful. I was wondering if you had examples of, films that inspired you in terms of tackling horror and enslavement. I mean, I don't think there are that many that are maybe good, but I mean, do you have things in mind? Yeah.
There's been more recently, like I briefly mentioned like Antebellum, which is a movie I actually don't like and I don't think is very effective. Um, but I do think when it comes to depicting slavery on film, a lot of the time, films that aren't even really intended to be horror films, when you have that personal connection, because I'm Black and my ancestors were enslaved, they feel like horror movies, even if they're not really intended to be that way. Like when I was watching 12 Years a Slave, it felt like a horror film to me. When I watch The Color Purple, certain elements of that feel horrific. Because I can feel them in that shared familial cultural memory. And because it's so easy for me to put myself or my ancestors or my family in the place of the characters. And that empathy that you feel can be really, really hard to grapple with. It can be really difficult and really effective for connecting with the characters. So I think, slavery, a lot of the time, the best examples of horror films with slavery aren't horror films at all.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this concept of collective memory that you mentioned, and these kind of preconceived notions that viewers already have in their minds about different eras. Do you feel like we are like we've already been bombarded with so many kind of like misrepresentations or kind of and like flattenings or like making one dimensional or oversimplifying or illusions and so on. Like I would just be curious. I don't want to like, I don't mean to like put words in your mouth when I'm asking about those kinds of things, but like I would like to hear more from you about what you think this collective memory like sort of consists of and what we have to grapple with in sort of like undoing or unlearning some of these things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel I'm not a stickler for all representations of history having to be completely accurate. I think sometimes it's fun to engage with preconceived notions people have about history by going in a more fantastical direction. But I think that that has to be intentional. And I think that, when you're dealing with things that are atrocious about history, slavery, colonialism, war, you do kind of owe it to the people that you're talking about in a way, um, to deal with their story and the experiences that they went through in a way that kind of enlightens the viewer a little bit in some way, and that can just be enlightening them and focusing on the emotion. It can also be enlightening them in more of a factual way. But yeah, I think the collective memory that we have definitely varies from location to location. Someone in the United States is going to have a very different idea of what enslavement was and what the weight of it is than somebody who lives in like Western Europe, for example. And also that also breaks down to just identities. Like a Black person in the U.S. is going to have a very different understanding of enslavement and where they stand on in relation to it than a white person living in Australia. Um, so I think filmmakers really have to take into consideration that when they're thinking about who they're making films for, some of the people who are going to be consuming those films are going to have a much deeper relationship to what's going on screen, and some people are going to come in and just kind of have like a very flat understanding of it. Not sure if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Sabina Strobler. Can you talk about how and where the textiles for the quilts came from, etc.?
Yeah. So some of them were we one of the people who worked with Sarah Barnes, she is a textile expert at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and a lot of them came from her personal just like stock of very, very old textiles. Some of them we ordered from eBay. We were looking online for like older quilts that maybe and blankets that maybe were from around the time period, or that were maybe used using the same techniques that would have been used during that time period. And then we were cutting them up and reassembling them. So a lot of it was just stuff people had that they'd collected, that maybe they'd inherited from like their grandparents or something, or just blankets that had been passed down that they weren't using. So we were really looking for things that were old, that were lived in, that were already kind of worn. And that maybe even if they weren't from the 1800s, that even if they weren't from 1815, that maybe would have been made using the same techniques.
Are you currently working on any other TV or film productions?
No. I'm starting my PhD, so that is where my focus is, but hopefully one day.
Any other questions from the crowd? Or if it's not too early to ask, do you want to tell us what the focus of your PhD research will be?
Yes, it is on Black Atlantic history, specifically as it relates to the body. So more of what my my undergraduate thesis was on. So, yep.
Looking forward to hearing more about that if you ever wish to present on it in the future. Then, if there's no further comments or questions,
I think that Melissa just asked about your Substack, but you don't have that set up yet, right?
No, it'll be the same handle as my Instagram. So if you want to follow me there, that's where I'll be posting links to that coming up soon.
great. Then, thank you so much, Adia Cullors, for being with us today. And if you want to hear Adia talking about some other research of hers, she participated in the Black Women in Horror panel that we had in person at our festival a couple years ago. And that is on our YouTube channel, Final Girls Berlin YouTube page. So yeah, thanks again, and we will be back here in a little less than 1 hour with a talk by Sam Deegan. We'll get the title of that talk for you. Or do you have it on hand, Ellie?
I don't want to say anything
Title.
wrong here.
Yeah,
So let
I
me
have it
just
here. It is
quickly.
called The Ghosts of
Got it.
Gothic Art House Cinema. And that will be at 6. And then at 8, we have a maternal horror panel with Ariel McLeese and Rhonda Jackson Joseph. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll be in person February 8th to 11th in Berlin. And you can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook. There's a Patreon as well. And
Twitter.
yes,
All right.
rest of your day, everyone. And thanks again.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.